All right. Thank you very much for being here tonight. It's an incredible honor and privilege for me to be here with Donna Orange for her talk on climate emergency and radical ethics, colonialism, radical injustice, and climate justice. Tonight's joint lecture is being hosted by the Lynch School's Psychological Humanities and Ethics Initiative and the Guestbook Project's Hosting Earth program. I'm Matthew Clementi. I've been completely honored and humbled to be a part of both the Psychological Humanities and Ethics Initiative here at Boston College and also the Hosting Earth lecture series. I've been hosting the Psychologies of the Earth series this semester, and those videos are available online if you'd like to see more of talks like this evening's. I'll talk a little bit about the structure of what we'll be doing here tonight, and then I'll introduce Donna, and then after that we'll get into the talk. This is our first hybrid event, so kind of roll with us as we work out some of the kinks. We're joined here at Boston College, and we have a great audience here tonight. I'm very thrilled to have you. And we also have, I think the last total was something like 150 people joining us on Zoom. Here's what our structure will look like this evening. First, I'll introduce Donna, and then I'll hand things off to her for the lecture. After, at the conclusion of her talk, I'll have a few questions that I'll pose to her, and I'm hoping it can be really conversational between the two of us so we can kind of keep it loose and enjoyable. And then after that, we'll open up to Q&A between either people who are here or also I have someone who will be able to relay questions from those joining us from this time. So let me introduce Donna. I'll get into the write-up that I have of her in a minute, but first I'd like to share just a very brief story to give some context for Donna. I was at dinner with her earlier this evening and with David Goodman, who runs this initiative here through the Lynch School, and he was talking about how he first met Donna. And the story was that an advisor of his when he was in grad school about 10 years ago said to him, you know, what psychologists would you really like to learn from? Whose work do you admire? What thinkers do you want to engage with? And he mentioned Donna, and he obviously didn't know her at the time. And his advisor said, well, if you'd like to talk to someone like her, reach out to her. And he was a grad student at the time and said, no, I've read all of her books. You don't do things like that. And his advisor said, well, why not? And so he wrote her, and Donna said, well, I'm in New York. That's not too far away. Why don't you drive down and we can have a conversation? And David did drive down, and then he drove down again the next month, and the next month, and now they have this really deep and important friendship. And I was really kind of touched to hear that story because it reminded me a lot of my experience in grad school, actually with Richard Carney, who's here tonight. I'm honored, was my dissertation director, and is also running the Guestbook Project's conference. That's a rare quality in the academy. It's not something that happens that often, unfortunately. But to hear stories like that, I think, tells you everything you need to know about the thinker who you're engaging with. So it's an incredible privilege for me to be here tonight with Donna, and it's so wonderful to hear that someone who's touched my life as much as David has been so inspired by her and by her work. Donna has 2 doctorates, one in philosophy from Fordham University, and another in clinical psychology from Yeshiva University. Yeshiva. Her work is interdisciplinary in nature, and she's given us the gift of introducing many clinicians. In fact, I'm a part of a group of philosophers, theologians, and clinicians who read her work. Has given us inroads into the world of philosophy that's very, very accessible for the untrained. So those of us who haven't studied philosophy, she really brings philosophy down to a level that's accessible for all of us. Some of her books that perform this deeply translational work are Thinking for Clinicians, The Suffering Stranger. I have her most recent work here, Psychoanalysis, History, and Radical Ethics. And tonight's lecture will be inspired by, in part, work she did in Climate Crisis, Psychoanalysis, and Radical Ethics. Donna's been a great friend to the Psychological Humanities and Ethics Initiative here at Boston College, and a long-standing contributor to the Psychology and the Other conference and the community of conversations that revolve around that. Her voice has been priceless and continues to bring us into deeper conversation with one another. I'm just delighted to be talking to you tonight. So without further ado, Donna Orange.
Thank you so much, Matt. Can you all hear me here in the room? And does this sound good? Okay, good. I'm deaf in one ear, so I worry about these things. Learning to hear has a lot to do with the deafness. It is our second time doing something together, and it's really a pleasure to work with you again. Let's see. I also want to say parenthetically that it is a real honor to be sort of hitched onto the front of your Guestbook climate project, Richard. And I'm envious of you here at Boston College to get a chance to work with all these wonderful people. But the hospitality of everybody here has been just absolutely first-rate. I'm very grateful. Your invitation to speak with you this evening, I feel, is a tremendous and undeserved honor. But your choice to ask me to talk about perhaps the most serious threat that we all face together, I'm supposed to be facing that camera, remind me if I forget, that's an honor to you. That you're here to hear about this, which is not a light or happy topic. Since I first wrote most of what you will hear after my 2016 book that Matt showed you, things have only gotten worse. And as I think you probably know, now the scientific information describes not climate change, but climate emergency. When I wrote this book, Obama was president. We had not yet withdrawn from the climate accords. What has happened since, both in terms of the scientific problem, data, the floods, the fires, the sea levels rising, the freakish weather, all of that has greatly worsened in recent years, but the political situation and willingness to tackle this has also gone through, let's say, ups and downs, not to put too fine a point on it. The political will to face the reality has diminished. We hope that it's resurgent now, but it's a big question. All of the front of our consciousness right now is full of Ukraine. But if Ukraine should be telling us anything, it's our dependence on fossil fuels that is at stake here, and only tackling that is our way to get past authoritarians. Who would have thought that what we're talking about tonight and this terrible situation in Eastern Europe would come together so strongly? If you didn't see Tom Friedman's op-ed piece in the New York Times this week, look for it. He discusses how these things go together. My Climate Psychology Alliance friends now are hearing voices like those of Jem Bendell, who writes of deep and humane adaptation as we prepare for the imminent end of a habitable climate. David Wallace Wells is writing pieces like Time to Panic. On the other hand, the Sunrise Movement people, like Jeremy Ornstein, with whom I'll be having this discussion at BIPSI on Saturday, and thank you, Jack, for being here. There's new courage and new courageous voices coming, and these folks take this more seriously than we oldsters seem to know how to do. The The big question now has become, do we have time to change, even if we can summon the political will? If not, how should we live for the time being? So let us begin as if we still had time to think about this and to do something about it. I addressed this book and a lot of the thinking here to my psychoanalytic colleagues. But some of you, many of you are interdisciplinarians, and you are interested in this whether you're psychoanalysts or psychoanalytically oriented directly or not. So, make the appropriate substitutions if you need to. We're now more alert to our responsibility to the world's most vulnerable people, more conscious of our solidarity with those who suffer, but we've seemed to have worked mostly in a bubble. Certainly in my 35 years as a psychoanalyst, I would say yes. I was working in a bubble. I thought I was doing something wonderful, one-to-one, one at a time, in a quiet little room. Climate change, however, has already, scientists tell us in the most urgent voices they can find, it has become an emergency, threatening to overwhelm all attempts to stem the primarily human-created disaster. Still, for the most part, we psychoanalysts and psychotherapists were quietly and faithfully on, living as we always did, driving to work, flying to conferences, at least until COVID. This is my first time out. Watering our lawns, eating and consuming mindlessly. Meanwhile, most political and financial leaders conspire to hide ominous truths, no longer simply inconvenient, but now dire, and we allow ourselves not to notice. Are we psychotherapists who should perhaps do better, conspiring or colluding to sustain an environmental unconscious? Is this okay? All okay? Are we helping to silence the canary in the coal mine? Having received extensive education and training, often including mandatory personal analysis to prepare us for our work, we have, I believe, also acquired responsibility to be leaders, moral if not scientific, in confronting the global crisis we are living. We possess the intellectual and communal resources to take on this responsibility. So far, however, we have been resoundingly silent. Where are the psychoanalysts? We who rightly or wrongly consider ourselves intellectual leaders in psychotherapy and in understanding human motivation. Perhaps we have learned nothing from the example of Sigmund Freud, who, blinded by his passion for his work, his love for Enlightenment German culture, and his need to be as important as Copernicus and Darwin, could not see that he and his Jewish family, as well as psychoanalysis itself, faced mortal danger in Vienna in the late 1930s. In another strange, he didn't see it until they came and arrested his daughter, Donna. That's what tipped the considerations. In another strange example, a few years later in the London Blitzkrieg, during one of the British Psychoanalytic Society's furious disputes about the origins of hatred and aggression, Donald Winnicott noted their actual effects. He stood up in a meeting and said, "I should like to point that there is an air raid going on. They're so busy fighting each other that they didn't notice an air raid." Are we too so absorbed in our theories, or worse, in our theoretical and interdenominational disputes over who belongs and who does not, that we fail to notice that human-caused planetary warming threatens to destroy the world within which we practice our beloved profession? We say that all is grist for the psychoanalytic mill, but what if this crisis threatens the survival of the mill itself? We psychoanalysts, I believe, together with our colleagues in other therapeutic areas, actually have a unique contribution to make in this crucial moment. We can help not only to refocus our own attention on the imminent threats to our own way of life, but to the world's most vulnerable people and to the earth which supports us all. In the best psychoanalytic tradition, we can notice the forms of historical unconsciousness, the still walking ghosts of the narrative unconscious. Mark Freeman's work is known to some of you, keeping us insensitive to the suffering in which we are implicated and to those to whom we are responsible. We can call out the more selfish of the defenses that keep us avoidant and name the forms of traumatic shock that keep us too paralyzed to respond at the level of the threat. We can help with the processes of mourning, not only the remembered ways of life, but also the loss of many kinds of hope and certainty for the future. Learning from Latin American climate justice leaders, from First Nations leaders in Canada and elsewhere, from the youth movements like Sunrise, we can ask ourselves and each other, including our patients, what really matters in times of crisis, thus responding more creatively than our analytic forebears did. But we have no time to waste. In Bill McKibben's words, there is no longer any long haul. I will skip most of the science for two reasons. I expect that this group already knows about the rising sea levels, the disappearing ice, the fast increasing desertification, and the intensifying storms and fires. And secondly, because it gets exponentially worse every month, with the news of freakish events outstripping the predictions. But for some years, even the NOAA, that's the National Atmospheric people, the weather folks, and IPCC, that's International Panel on Climate Change of the United Nations, they have emphasized that risks are unevenly distributed and are generally greater for disadvantaged people and communities in countries of all levels of development. In other words, it's a question of justice. It's not just a question of here are the facts, here's a problem, it's a question of justice. Significant climate changes already underway will require major adaptations, especially to protect the most vulnerable people. Whole island populations must relocate and are already relocating in the face of rising sea levels, while refugees from war and famine are already pouring into Europe, not to mention the current war. Without radical changes away from fossil fuels, including substantial decreases in consumption, initiated immediately, warming of 4 degrees is both extremely probable, they warn, and will make our planet uninhabitable by the end of this century. Now that is now considered an optimistic prediction. That the U.S. withdrew from the Paris Accords and has reversed most of its climate regulations means that the whole world is on an ever faster path to destruction. I will return to this point. Isn't this a wonderful good news lecture? Most of us go on just as if we had not heard these warnings. Are our brains simply wired to exclude bad news, as George Marshall believes? Are we in the grip of environmental melancholia, as social scientist, reader of psychoanalysis Renee Lertzman thinks? Or frozen by climate trauma, as I have wondered? Or have we, and this is really what I think, inherited a philosophical egoism, wedded to a narcissistic mindset full of entitlement, perhaps even of unconscious racist privilege, inherited from millennia of slavery, trapping and immobilizing us? All this may be true, but if the disciplines of philosophy, history, and psychoanalysis can help us to identify our problem quickly, then perhaps alliance with the world's moral and religious leaders can begin to shift the political tide, to create a tipping point of solidarity to meet the carbon tipping points already looming and perhaps already passed. Let's talk about enlightenment egoism. We Westerners inherit an outsized share of the guilt and responsibility for climate change. Whatever we may think of China now, we in the West set the industrialization at all costs pattern they have followed. As Stephen M. Gardner writes, the USA is responsible for 29% of global emissions since the onset of the Industrial Revolutions. And the nations of the EU, 26%. By contrast, China and India are responsible for 8% and 2%, respectively. To understand what has gone so wrong in our relation to the earth, including our indifference to its most destitute people, we must at least mention the egoistic roots of the scientific rationalism and political individualism emerging in 17th and 18th century Europe. These became founding ideals in the United States, and I think we might say they have metastasized in the last few years. We must also remember that the climate crisis, as we said before, affects us humans unequally. That some of us are still reasonably comfortable, while many already, and increasingly a large majority, remain hungry, homeless, and destitute. Some of us have far more coping resources than do our brothers and sisters across the tracks or across the world. Some of us can move away from rising water, from famine, and from war. We might say with Emmanuel Levinas, phenomenologist and prophet whose radical ethics we take up later, that to respond ethically, we must allow ourselves to be traumatized, taken hostage by the useless suffering of these others. From the Talmud he quoted, to leave men without food is a fault that no circumstance attenuates. The distinction between the voluntary and the involuntary does not apply here. We're leaving people without food. Our guilt is not reduced by whether we knew about it or not. We're supposed to know about it. In other words, not knowing that my lifestyle creates starvation and misery for others is no excuse. The fault remains. Thus, climate justice theorists speak of carbon debt that polluters like us owe to those whose health and survival continues to be destroyed by our way of life, whether we know it or not. Levinas commented, before the hunger of men, I missed something here. Anyway, hunger is measured only objectively. It is irrecusable. So we measure it as, okay, this many people are hungry. So what's he mean by saying it's irrecusable? It means that I cannot take myself off from the guilt of this, from the accusation of it, or the responsibility of it. You know how they say that judges recuse themselves for cases where they're implicated or something? I can't recuse myself from this situation. He often quoted from Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, we are guilty, responsible of all and before all, and I more than all the others. Double-mindedness, even when traumatically induced, does not exonerate. It simply leads to, we didn't know anything, from people who saw their neighbors loaded into boxcars and taken back. We too are pretending to ourselves not to know, especially how our lives of privilege impoverish and endanger our fellow human beings. Do we realize that many, if not most, of the refugees that Europe and the US are turning away are climate refugees? And that there will be many more, even here? And then there's Ukraine. And I won't go there for a moment, but I kind of expect that in the discussion we may get into some of that. But traumatically paralyzed, we may not notice our guilt and responsibility. You know, if I'm sitting here asking whether it's ethical to have children or not, given what I would be bringing those children into, I might not even be able, it may paralyze my thinking. I'm not saying I can't think about that, but many young people are thinking about that, maybe some of the ones in this room. Martin Luther King talked about the fierce urgency of now. This worries many of us. By the time we wake up, millions more of the world's poorest will have died from hunger, and global warming's worst effects may be here immediately. So how did we get into such a pickle? I'm going to say later that about half of global warming has happened in the last 25 years. This is something that's just exploded. So here's a thought about what may be problematic here, and I'd be interested to hear what you think when we get to discussing. Unconscious and silent about the U.S. history of settler colonialism, ignorant and mute about our crimes of chattel slavery and racial domination, neither governments nor citizens can seriously tackle climate injustice until we confront this 400-year history. This is my thesis, the central thesis of what I'm saying tonight. It accuses the me, ever guilty and responsible, but locates the problems in a shared historical and narrative unconscious, in a we. So let us imagine another crowd of ghosts. Any of you who know the work of Hans Lowell will know what I'm referring to here. And I'm not, by the way, just talking about the far right political French in this, or we should go French in this country. Let's imagine a crowd of ghosts inhabiting our ethical unconsciousness. Though intellectual ghosts may live to cause trouble, think of Descartes with his isolated I, or John Locke, whose thinking underlies the founding documents in our country, but he owned stock in companies that were importing slaves from Africa. Now let us consider the historical unburied crimes, our collective ghosts, though largely unconscious of settler colonialism and chattel slavery in the Americas, and especially in the United States, founded on an explicit ideal of human equality. I choose colonialism and slavery because our habits of keeping these crimes, genocides before the term came to usage after World War II, our habit of keeping these crimes hidden from ourselves may also be keeping us unaware of the impacts of climate change on people who live out of our daily sight. The history in North America, from where I write, begins with two nations, England and France, competing to rule a land allegedly empty of human beings, according to the doctrine of terra nullius, first invoked by the Spanish and Portuguese, then used to destroy the indigenous Australians. Then came terra nullius, means empty land. It means that nobody lives there. So the status of whatever beings were there is not human. Then came the young United States with its manifest destiny and an expansive Canada, destroying the indigenous peoples. Canada, it seems, has recently attempted much greater acknowledgement of its First Nations than we have done in the United States, where we call them Native Americans, oblivious to the preference of most for being called by their tribal names. I have a close neighbor out in California who's from the Seneca And he hates being called a Native American. He said, I'm a Seneca. You know, give me the due of at least calling me what I am. Settler colonialism does not simply manage colonies as Britain did in England, in India. Arrogant as this process may be, but it replaces the people living there, as in Australia and New Zealand, Canada, and what became the United States, as if the beings living there were not fellow human beings at all, or whose lives mattered in any way. Judith Butler would say these lives had been treated as unbreathable. Calling ourselves a nation of immigrants, we do not even notice their loss. Chattel slavery names the system, including in particular the African slave trade of the 15th through 19th centuries, of claiming to own, buy and sell, inherit and force to work, usually by extreme violence, human beings. Other forms of slavery, including those practiced by the Nazis and in the Soviet gulags, as well as forms of child labor and sex slavery, unspeakably reprehensible as they are and cause of untold human suffering, are not under direct discussion here. My argument is that chattel slavery, the peculiar institution that formed the United States Constitution, giving outsized power to the slaveholding South and haunting us to this day, has dulled our moral consciousness to the point of unconsciousness. What we do not know, really, profoundly, and extensively, and personally know, Freud taught us, we are bound to repeat. Together with the colonialist past we all share, this history of slavery and its ongoing effects, of which we rarely speak, although there's more speaking now, kind of from George Floyd on, I guess. But a lot of resistance to it, isn't it? Anyway, the history of slavery and its ongoing effects, of which we rarely speak, blinds us to the misery that our carbon and methane spewing lifestyles are creating in the global South. We are repeating exactly, for instance. For many of us, this history briefly became real a few years back in the film 12 Years a Slave, making us realize that massive human rights violations have not all occurred only elsewhere in Germany, Austria, Chile, and South Africa, for example. We in the United States live every day from the history and continuance of precarity, again Judith Butler, generated by the conscious and unconscious racism with which Ta-Nehisi Coates and others now confront us. Writing to his son, Coates reminds us, and I quote, "Enslavement is not a parable, it is damnation. It is the never-ending night. And the length of that night is most of our history. Never forget that we were enslaved in this country longer than we have been free. Never forget that 250 years, for 250 years, Black people were born into chains. Whole generations followed by more generations who knew nothing but chains." Unquote. Actually, we might consider whether Europe and North America, especially we in the United States, suffer from a superiority complex. This is just something I made up. Symptoms of such a complex might include, one, the presumption that we own land stolen from indigenous peoples who lived upon it communally just because we bought it from people who owned it before us. Two, the presumption that the ways we who think ourselves white, that's another Ta-Nehisi Coates expression, the way we who think ourselves white do things are the right ways. The presumption, third, that others worldwide should learn English, while we have no obligation to learn Spanish or other widely spoken languages. 4, a general insensitivity to our own arrogance and sense of superiority, easily degenerating into violence against those whom we consider inferior. 5, an incapacity to imagine ourselves into a predicament of those to whom we feel superior, thus a blunting of empathy and compassion. And 6, a sense that the earth belongs to us, the so-called whites, and that others, they, exist to serve our economic interests, to mine the minerals we want or need, to make us cheap clothes, to work at below poverty wages, and so on. This complex, which you will not read about anywhere else because I made it up, with its embedded assumptions, largely unconscious and invisible, forms a web of life, generating comfort among those who carry it, and creating death and fury among those we dominate. We do not know that we suffer from it in our fundamental humanity. And for lots of documentation about this, look at Isabel Wilkerson's cast. Psychoanalysis and double-mindedness. By double-mindedness, however, I mean something much more problematic than mere denial. Double-minded, we live in two realities at once. We know about the climate crisis, and perhaps even that it is rapidly becoming dire. But in a mental gesture akin to throwing up our hands, we say, this is too big for me or for any individual. Only systemic changes matter. And of course, systemic changes matter. So we go on working with our patients and our psychoanalytic politics as humanistically as we know how to work, while our common home becomes a burning world. That's from Phil Cushing. Essentially, we, like Freud in the 1930s, and like the millions of ordinary Germans in the period studied by Tom Kohut and others, we have disabled the fire alarm. To accomplish this, as we shall see, we have taught ourselves not to see those worst affected as human, just like ourselves, as others whose suffering matters. We could spend chapters, articles, and books asking how this happens. A vast literature on multiple types of dissociation and Freudian repression is now available to us. And if anyone wants to know, I can give you a bibliography. More immediately useful might be to ask, how faced with crisis, we living daily in our professional minds with these concepts might emerge rapidly to protect our common home. Will our theories help us enough? Surely they have not until now. Or do we need something else to shake us out of our analytic slumbers? Speaking to psychoanalysts who often characterize ourselves as not belonging to the STEM sciences, STEM disciplines, but to the tellers of stories, philosopher Judith Butler writes, but what if the narrative reconstruction of a single life cannot be the goal of psychoanalysis? And that the reason for this has to do with the very formation of the subject. If the other is always there from the start, in the place where the ego will be, and this is a reference to Freud's where the it was, the ego shall become, then a life is constituted through a fundamental interruption. Fundamental interruption is even interrupted prior to the possibility of any continuity. My guess is that we cannot see, cannot feel this prior interruption of the other, primarily because we are so embedded in the cultures that have created the climate problem. As many have noted, Freud grew up intellectually in and was deeply attached to the Enlightenment and Romantic European culture that enshrined individual autonomy as the ultimate good. We psychoanalysts and most psychotherapists have inherited his deep assumptions, along with a certain blindness to threats to the common good. Additionally, attached to these old cultures in part because of the traumatic background of contemporary psychoanalysis, the whole generation that taught me, many of them were people who had fled Europe during and before and during World War II. These old cultures, we're attached to these old cultures in part because of the traumatic background of contemporary psychoanalysis, creating a desperate need for home. We may have forgotten the other destitute homeless of the world, in particular of the Southern Hemisphere. We need a contextualist analysis of our double-mindedness and a radical ethic to shake us out of it. Climate shame, one form of this double-mindedness, takes, I believe, two principal forms, intricately related. One is the fear of visible vulnerability that keeps us indifferent to the nature and extent of the crisis. And two, the continuing envy of those who have more. Envy is the flip side of shame, in my view. So that those deprived of essential needs become invisible. In our striving, we reach for more space, larger houses and cars, more things, perfect bodies that resist growing or appearing old. Entangled together, these two aspects of shame feed self-enclosed preoccupation, utterly distracting us from the descriptions and warnings of the best climate science. You know, if what's on my mind when I walk down the street is what a beautiful coat you've got on and how I could get one of those, or what's wrong with me so I don't have such good taste and be able to wear the coat or the shoes or something, how have I got any mental space to notice the people who have no coat or no food? So the fear of vulnerability keeps us self-protected and enclosed, endangering us humans, other species, and our planetary home. Without the fundamental experience of being held and cherished, we lack the emotional sense of belonging among other human beings or else anywhere. Thus, we treat our world, and implicitly ourselves, like disposable garbage. The second, envy, attempts to restore an ersatz well-being, to cover up the rotten sense of shame with fame, money, and glamour. Any sense that others have more occludes our ethical vision, blinding us to our involvement in injustice and deafening us to the cries of those we are harming every day. Much less can we, envious of those who have more, notice that we in the first world live as beneficiaries of massive injustices perpetrated by our colonialist ancestors on the indigenous first peoples in the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere. We also live every day on prosperity originally created by systems of human bondage called slavery. For this unconsciousness to fade or to wake up morally, we would need that indispensable and painful moral form of shame. Awareness of our implication in systems of evil to replace the shame and envy that traps us in compulsive consuming. Just as psychoanalytic treatment of shame begins to restore to the mistreated a sense of inclusion in the human community, so can a psychoanalytic sensibility sensitive to the corrosive and isolating effects of shame begin to link us all with each other. We can begin to understand that our well-being depends on the well-being of others, Ubuntu, solidarity, and restore the old notion of the common good. Now let's talk a bit about radical ethics. I think of two, I'm going to talk about Levinas, but I also think of Knud Eiler Løgstrup from Denmark as another and more accessible in some ways, a writer of radical ethics. They both lived through World War II in Europe. There's something not surprising about this. And I can, if we have extra time, I can compare what I'm calling radical ethics with ordinary, the other ordinary, either rule-based or virtue-based ethics. Okay, inverting all standard ethical accounts, radical ethics upends moral reasoning by starting from the suffering other, invading my self-satisfied life, not from the presumed moral agent. In other words, it doesn't start from me. It starts from the other, whose need faces me, whose vulnerability faces me. Emptied of ego by a pre-originary responsibility, I am commanded by the other's starvation. William Middleclass provides a compact argument for what I am calling a radical ethics of climate change. He says, because Levinasian ethics begins in and ever returns to the suffering other, the suffering of those whose lives are negatively impacted by climate change, rupture arguments that justify or justify neglecting individual greenhouse gas emissions. Levinas acknowledges that in nourishing ourselves, we take food that can feed others. And he really refuses to break the link. In other words, my irrecusable responsibility to the vulnerable and suffering other does not go away just because I need to drive or fly somewhere. You can take me up on my flight here later. Nor is it lessened because this vulnerable other ekes out of their existence in the southern hemisphere, less visible to me. Philosopher Robert Bernasconi writes, a hungry child in a distant land is no longer out of our reach. If globalization means living in a world in which the terms near and far, stranger and neighbor no longer have the same meaning for us as they once did, because everyone is now recognized as within the same circle, then and this is his big point, the hunger of the most marginalized members of the global society must become its fundamental reference point. I'm going to repeat that because I think it's so important. The hunger of the most marginalized members of the global society must become its fundamental reference point. The other's precarious life questions me, accuses me, persecutes me. The close consequence of this endless responsibility links it to the political. There is no place, writes Bernasconi, for an ethical discourse that is not also inextricably linked with recognition of the political context it is its task to interrupt. We have to be interrupters. He explains that experiences of persecution link us to others, enslaved, impoverished, homeless, in solidarity. Watching the thousands of families seeking shelter in Europe in 2015, those who remember their own suffering could be better able to respond. Instead, oblivious to the causes of the misery that brings children and adults to our southern border here in the U.S., we compete to boast about who can build the largest and most robust wall against them. Most of us, unless affected by tornadoes, hurricanes, and wildfires, have no memory of this kind of suffering. When the sufferers look much like us, perhaps white and even affluent, we rush to help them rebuild. But many of those devastated by hurricanes like Katrina are already poor and or dark-skinned, so we treat them just as we treat the refugees. How do we come to see them as our brothers and sisters? Can memory, either of our own sufferings or of past courage and generosity, begin to activate us in the nick of time? In Merle Westfall's words, conscience need not make cowards of us all. It can make us brothers and sisters. The radical ethics of response to the other implies disrupting massive political injustice when we are able to see it. It means that other suffering persecutes me, takes me hostage, requires substitution, one for the other. It demands hospitality to people displaced by war, poverty, and terror. By the way, Ukrainians are showing up right in my neighborhood just south of San Diego now. They're trying to come into this country through Mexican access. Even if we cannot speak their languages, we can see their desperate faces. We must remember. In our own history, we can remember quiet activists sitting at segregated lunch counters, sitting at the front of segregated buses, disrupting injustice. Now we find Indigenous peoples of Canada, the US, and elsewhere sitting down to close the roads to tar sands drilling equipment. But we need more than only the persecuted to stand in solidarity against injustice. How do we find our ethical bones? Even when the photo of a drowned 3-year-old refugee on a Mediterranean beach stops us for a moment in our tracks, how do we keep our ethical imagination awake? Determined that a world in which some lives are regarded as expendable cannot continue. We need an ethic that arises from these extreme situations because we face one now. Let us hear these words from Levinas. Justice remains justice only in a society where there is no distinction between those close and those far off, but in which there also remains the impossibility of passing by the closest. The equality of all is borne by my inequality, the surplus of my duties over my rights. Surplus of my duties over my rights. The forgetting of self moves justice, he says. In addition, philosopher J. Aaron Simmons argues convincingly that we face what he calls a meta-ethical emergency. A situation like that facing Britain in 1939 as it considered whether the ordinary laws of war still applied in facing an imminent threat to all civilized life. That we confront, Simmons claims, the looming destruction of a livable world means we do not have the leisure for ordinary ethics. And again, we can talk more about that later if you want. For ordinary ethics concerned equally for all species. We must, he believes, immediately prioritize the most vulnerable humans suffering from the effects of climate change if we are to have any chance of motivating the type, extent, and rapidity of change needed. Ordinary ethics, such as the duty and utilitarian theories alluded to, even including deep ecology perhaps, belong to everyday life. Quote, in the context of a meta-ethical emergency, writes Simmons, there is no time to advocate theories that do not have a good enough chance of motivating a reasonable public response to the crisis. We have to treat our current situation as an extreme humanitarian emergency. It's hard to do. Not something to measure against competing ideals and philosophies. Paraphrasing Simmons, emergencies call for a kind of ethical triage. And that he calls a hierarchy of ethico-political significance. David Glass, in the same vein, writes that Levinas provides a way of understanding how the singular subject's moral responsibility is the condition for the possibility of collective responsibility. Response to the face of the suffering sister and brother creates political change through prophetic action. So, thinking further back, much further back, let's remember the story of Cain and Abel. We notice a missing shame in Cain's insolent response to God. I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? Without mentioning Cain's murderous violence, the question had come, where is Abel's brother? It comes to him as a gracious invitation for repentance and repair. Cain shamelessly refuses its underlying premise of responsibility and models only the, we knew nothing of the extermination camps, but also the, send them back where they came from, this is our country. If they aren't smart enough to get rich from oil, fracking, and coal, too bad for them. In the face of such attitudes, rampant in Europe and North America, only a robust solidarity enacting our answer to Cain can begin to solve the problems of climate justice. We can make common cause with romantics who love the earth and its many species. I do myself as a native Oregonian. But fundamentally, we must find ourselves as each other's keepers. We can remember here also, I'm getting it. We can remember here also the African ethics of Ubuntu, well explained by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The person with Ubuntu is open and available to others, affirming of others, does not feel threatened when others are able and good. Knowing that he or she belongs in a greater whole and is diminished when others are humiliated or diminished when others are tortured or oppressed. Conclusions. Finally, first, what can we not conclude? Clearly, the radical ethics we are discussing cannot help either psychotherapists or international public policy experts to decide the best road to climate justice. People propose things like equal per capita entitlements, rights to subsistence emissions, priority to the least well-off, or equalizing marginal costs. Nor does radical ethics tell us how to move the seemingly unmovable forces of power and money arrayed against climate justice. These same power systems forbid us to associate climate change and its effects with social justice. We must look to the wisdom accumulated by those who overturned apartheid, organized the civil rights movement, and finally brought the Vietnam War to a close, as well as to our partners in the indigenous communities so affected by climate devastation, if we want to find our way. Radical ethics does not provide rules, strategies, political philosophy, and structures. Instead, it confronts each and all of us with our responsibility, without beginning and without end, inescapable for our world and for each other. Radical ethics means that we cannot go on as we did yesterday, self-satisfied that we are doing our best or shifting our personal responsibility onto the system. The terrified faces of destitute refugees, of those whose homes are being turned into desert or going beneath the sea, threatened by violence, forbid me to sleep comfortably and command me to respond. Every day I must allow them to persecute me, to pull me out of my comfortable life, to make me non-indifferent. For each of us, the response will take its own form, depending on how and where we see the useless suffering and hear the cries, and on what our own health allows. And yet a radical ethics never begins and never ends. The face of the suffering other demands a response from me before any agreement ever made. Yes, I am my brother's keeper from the start. And this responsibility continues. I, more than all the others, as both Dostoevsky and Levinas repeatedly wrote, for the extreme situation in which once again we find ourselves, perhaps only the ethic of hyperbolic responsibility can shake us out of our complacency. If not to save our own skin, still comfortable enough, am I not my brothers and sisters' keeper? And what if we have already procrastinated too long? Watching Greta Thunberg, I recommend you can find her on lots of YouTube talks. I want to believe we can all wake up and respond. But looking at Paradise, California, and Mozambique, and the Missouri River? Who knows? Is it time to mourn, to accept responsibility for the ethically unconscious way our generation has lived? After all, half the greenhouse gases in our atmospheres and oceans have come in the last 25 years. Do we retreat to higher ground, leaving the poor to drown and starve? To use the language of Hans Lobel, how do we atone not only for parricide, but for infanticide and fratricide? How do we live as humanly as possible in the time that is left? Thank you for listening to such dark questions.
Thank you so much, Donna. I, as you can see, have written a page and a half of notes here and questions that have come up to me. I'm going to try and synthesize some thoughts that occurred to me while you were speaking and really just present you with one question. Maybe we can talk a little bit, and then I'd love to reserve some time for people here or people at home who want to join in the conversation as well. I found your psychoanalytic reading of the climate crisis as a repetition of past behavior that's being repeated again through time, the repetition of a trauma that we continue to relive because we can't see it, won't see it, to be absolutely fascinating and really provocative reading of the situation. I've been reading I have some of my students here tonight, lots of Freud in each of this semester. Thank you for being here, my wonderful students. And I was struck by one thing you said, and it kind of ties together a lot of my thoughts that I wanted to engage with you on. You said that for Freud, what we don't know, we're bound to repeat. And that might be I just jotted that down, so I don't know if that's exactly what you said, but something along those lines. And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about the many crises that we face. And I was thinking about how my reading of Freud is that in many ways he picks up Nietzsche's emphasis on the tragic nature of human existence, and that Freud is a fundamentally tragic thinker, at least in my interpretation. And I was wondering how, with the kind of tragic structure that he puts forth, knowledge helps us to address these problems. When you get into the topic of radical ethics, it's the face of the other, the confrontation with the face of the other, that draws me out of myself and that awakens me to the vulnerability and the need that presents itself to me. I was thinking about that. It's obviously, I'm a huge fan of the brothers Karamazov. I love Dostoevsky, and Levinas obviously takes that up as well in very insightful ways. But I was thinking about that in relation to Freud, and particularly in relation to tragedy. You know, in Oedipus, he is confronted by his crime early on. He's told flat out, you murdered your father. Tiresias confronts him with that. He both won't see it, like you say of Cain, because he doesn't want to, but also he can't see it. It's something that he's blinded to. And at the end of the tragedy, knowledge doesn't bring change. He blinds himself. You know, that's all that he can do when he sees what he's done and what the truth of the situation is. I don't mean to be more bleak than you were and maybe more pessimistic than you were, so you'll forgive me. But these are the thoughts that are circling around me. You know, Oedipus is confronted with the face of the other. First in his father on the road, whom he murders, then in Tiresias, whom he, sends away and shuns. He's confronted again and again. So in this kind of radical ethics, what is it that inspires in us that shift from being confronted by the face of another that we can't see, won't see, refuse to see, but also maybe are unable to see? Turns us from that disposition to one that then is called into action, maybe capable of responding in the way that you're calling for. that's kind of my teasing together of a bunch of thoughts, but I have a lot more, but I'll let you take it.
Well, thank you so much. You clearly get what I'm talking about. And I think Freud was, as you say, a tragic thinker and absolutely fascinated by Greek tragedy, and you lay this out wonderfully. And in some ways pessimistic about the human condition, and absolutely torn between that and a fundamental kind of optimism. And that's why, whether I like the idea of drives and instincts or not, he's got these two competing ones. And that the optimist in Freud invented psychoanalysis to get us to acquaint ourselves, profoundly acquaint ourselves with what we don't want to know about ourselves, and hoped that that was going to help. Sometimes we can't see much evidence in the large scale that is really working, but those of us who have worked in this field know that it can help, at least on small scales. Whether it can help enough for something like this, large scale repetition, if you will, not just in your life or my life. That's the question that's really on the table here. And we could spend forever talking about whether human nature is such that it was bound to destroy itself. I have an old psychoanalytic friend saying, so-and-so has a case of the boundaries. It means that when this person meets a potential partner that's going to be terribly destructive, he's bound to take up with her or him or whatever. We're bound to do that, crazy thing over and over and over again. This can sound like a sort of massive case of boundaries. We're bound to repeat. And on the other hand, the optimist in Freud is going to say, if there's any way out from this, it's from our engagement, both personally and communally, with our history and with our conflicting desires and instincts and so on. So I do think psychoanalysis, in one sense, is not only been part of the problem, but is potentially part of the solution. But I think it also requires this fundamental non-indifference that I call it, right?